Hello historians, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Prof. J. I am your history professor. Pardon me. And today's video is going to briefly introduce you to Enlightenment thinker Voltaire and one of his works, a treatise on toleration. Voltaire, like Rousseau that we discussed in the previous video, is considered one of the pinnacles, one of the foundational pillars of Enlightenment thinking. He was a prolific writer who wrote plays, who wrote essays, who wrote short stories, who wrote treatises talking about the political and religious orientations of England when he was in exile there for 7 years. He reserved his most pointed attacks, though, for the institutionalized Catholic Church. Rousseau was not a fan of institutionalized religion. Our purposes, therefore, lead us to his work, A Treatise on Toleration. There is some debate among scholars about about Voltaire's own religious beliefs. There are some who argue he was a deist, as many Enlightenment thinkers were. Deists were those who believed that there was some sort of higher power that existed and created everything, but that higher power did not actually get involved in the day-to-day affairs of human beings. This higher power essentially created the universe and just set it off to do its own thing. Others, however, argue that Voltaire was an atheist. It was illegal in his time to be an atheist, so he used irony and sarcasm to disguise his atheism and make it seem like he was a deist when really he wasn't. That is a continuing debate. Whatever the case may be, deism or atheism, he did issue some serious criticisms towards institutionalized religion, and since this is Europe, we're going to be looking at the Catholic Church predominantly. Protestant Church also counts in this as well as religious superstitions that he felt were useless things. Contrary to Rousseau, where you can find a few works that will express an underlying set of principles and philosophies that will dictate Rousseau's thinking, it's harder to do that with Voltaire. It's hard to find one work that kind of expresses a dominant philosophy that you can find carrying through all or most of his other works. Rather, you really need to read the individual works themselves to get his criticisms and his philosophies about individual issues. So I think the best way to handle A Treatise on Toleration is to look at some specific quotes and analyze what those quotes tell us about Voltaire's beliefs, The first quote I have from A Treatise on Toleration is talking about superstition. And Voltaire says the following: "It is the same with excommunications. Our historians tell us that when King Robert was excommunicated by Pope Gregory V for marrying his godmother, the Princess Bertha, his domestic servants threw the meats to be served to the king right out the window. And Queen Bertha gave birth to a goose in punishment for the incestuous marriage." One could seriously doubt that in this day and age, the servants of the King of France, if he were excommunicated, would throw his dinner out the window, or that the queen would give birth to a goose. In this quote, we see Voltaire expressing his idea that people don't need superstitious stories to understand simple concepts. That fanciful story that Voltaire is referring to in the quote that I just showed you is meant to communicate to the faithful, don't commit incest. Don't sleep with your relatives. Don't procreate with your relatives. Voltaire is arguing that story is so stupid, that story is so out of bounds for belief, as to be more harmful than helpful. No one, argues Voltaire, would believe that someone would actually give birth to a goose if they committed incest. No one would believe that even such a figure as the King of France would see his servants disrespect him by throwing his food out of the window if he was excommunicated by the Pope for committing incest. Voltaire rather argues that people have enough reason in his day and age, in the 1760s is when he published this, that they can think for themselves. And they can understand concepts that an institution like the church would want them to understand. Rather than creating this fanciful story, the church can just say, hey, don't commit incest. and people will understand what that means. They don't need the ridiculous story to tell them not to sleep with their relatives. The church can just tell them to not sleep with their relatives, and people will go, got it, done. Or in this case, not done. They don't need the fanciful stories. We know that Voltaire is a big fan of this Enlightenment buzzword of reason and its role in replacing superstitions and replacing religious dogma, because Voltaire says the following: each day, reason penetrates further into France, into the shops of merchants as well as the mansions of lords. We must cultivate the fruits of this reason, especially since it is impossible to check its advance. So Voltaire is clearly a fan of reason. He's a fan of reason, he's a fan of rationality. And he argues that the advance of reason, that reason enlightening more and more people, from artisans living in cities to aristocrats living in country house mansions outside of cities, are being exposed to reason and are learning to think. They're learning to reason for themselves. They're learning to make rational decisions. He continues on later on in this quote by arguing we can't run France today the same way we ran France 200 years ago before the Enlightenment, before people began using reason in large numbers, before reason was enlightening people. We have to run France differently. We don't need the religious superstitions. We don't need the religious dogmas. We now have more and more people who can think, and we'll get more and more people who can think in the future. Because reason is inevitable. Reason is like Thanos from Endgame. He is inevitable. You can't check reason. So you don't need the fanciful stories. You don't need the superstitions anymore. Just tell people the truth. He carries on with this idea of superstitions, wrapping up this section by saying the following: but of all these superstitions is not the most dangerous that of hating your neighbor for his opinions. Here we see Voltaire begin to express some fundamental principles, including freedom of belief, of thought, of worship, and of speech. Voltaire was a powerful advocate for people being tolerated for their own thoughts, which is why this work is called a treatise on toleration, conveniently enough. Voltaire believed that people should not be persecuted for what they believe religiously or otherwise. Religiously, politically, socially, culturally. They should be left alone to have those thoughts. They should be able to have the internal thoughts about organizing politics differently or organizing society differently. They should be free to think those things. They should be free to speak about those things. They should be free to talk to people. Maybe we don't need a king anymore. Maybe we should have a constitutional monarchy like England has. Maybe we should have a constitution that gives the ordinary people rights and liberties and freedoms. People should be allowed to, argues Voltaire, say those things and not fear persecution from the state or other people in the society. They should prefer to worship however they wish and not have to follow the strict dogmas of the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church or any other institutionalized church. They should be able to believe what they want, think what they want, worship how they want, and speak how they want and what they want, without fear of being persecuted by individuals or institutions in their society. Voltaire is also going to include a couple of parables in this that will get to the heart of some of his criticisms of the way institutionalized churches like the Catholic Church behave. In this next parable you're about to see, he's speaking to an imam who is a priest in the Islamic faith and a Buddhist monk. And Voltaire says the following: this little globe, which is but a point, rolls through space, as do many other globes. We are lost in the immensity of the universe. Man, only 5 feet high, is assuredly only a small thing in creation. One of these imperceptible beings says to another one of his neighbors in Arabia or South Africa, "Listen to me, because God of all these worlds has enlightened me. There are 900 million little ants like us on the earth, but my ant hole is the only one dear to God. All the others are cast off by him for eternity. Mine alone will be happy. All of the others will be eternally damned. They, the imam and the monk, would then interrupt me and ask which fool blabbed all this nonsense. I would be obliged to answer, you yourselves. I would then endeavor to calm them, which would be very difficult. We see here in this parable of these ant holes a comparison to humans and how institutionalized churches work. In this parable, humans are the 900 ants, and the ant holes are the different religions they ascribe to. Voltaire's arguing that every institutionalized religion says to the people, my religion, my ant hole, is special. It is the only one dear to God. My religion has a monopoly on the path to salvation. Every other religion is wrong. Every other religion will lead to being damned eternally by God. Mine is the only one that's approved by him. They all say this, argues Voltaire. And they might not even, in this example of a discussion with two religious figures, realize that they're saying that until this parable is presented to them. Their response is they're saying, this is foolish. Who would say something so ridiculous? Not realizing that they themselves, by claiming a monopoly on the path to salvation, a monopoly on the path to God, a monopoly on the path to the afterlife, they are saying that. They are saying that they're the only ones who do this. And then when he says, you guys do this with your claims to being the only true faith, the one true faith with a capital O, a capital T, and a capital F, you say that your ant hole is the only one that's special. And then he says they'd probably be pretty angry at me and I'd have to try to calm them down, which, yeah, they probably would be, because they're having a mirror shown to them for some of the things that they say that Voltaire is now criticizing. Behaviors that, in another example, they themselves deem to be foolish. A second parable is one in which Voltaire is imagining a conversation with a Dominican inquisitor of the faith. Dominicans were a monastic order. They're a group of monks. They're very highly educated, and oftentimes they were employed by the church as part of the Holy Office or the Inquisition, the infamous Inquisition that would often use torture and other nefarious means to get people who have been accused of heresy, believing or practicing in a way the Catholic Church has not approved of, back into the fold and exposing others that could be hunted down and tortured or investigated to be brought back in the fold. And if they refuse to be brought back into the Catholic Church, or if they're brought back and they fall back into heresy, they're turned over to the state and burned, or executed in some other way, usually by burning. In this parable, Voltaire starts off by saying, hey, listen, everybody knows that in the Italian peninsula, there's lots of different dialects of Italian. There's one academy that's trying to standardize the language and saying the version of Italian that's spoken in the north, in Tuscany, that is now, we deem, the version of Italian. Everyone must speak that. Can you really, in order to enforce that, justify going to everyone in Italy that doesn't speak that dialect and then removing their tongues for violating this new rule that only the Tuscan dialect should be spoken? An allusion to the church saying only our belief system and methods of worship are acceptable, and if you don't follow our methods of belief and worship, we will hurt you physically. We pick up the quote and the parable from where the inquisitor responds. The inquisitor responds, there is a difference between your example of language in Italy and our Catholic Church practice. For us, the Inquisition, it is a matter of the health of your soul. It is for your good that the director of the Inquisition ordains that you be seized on the testimony of a single person, however infamous or criminal that person might be. That you will have no advocate to defend you. That the name of your accuser will not even be known by you. That the inquisitor can promise you mercy and immediately condemn you. That 5 different tortures will be applied to you, and then you will be flogged or sent to the galleys or ceremoniously burned. So in this parable, Voltaire is setting up the Inquisitor as arguing that the use of torture to bring people back into the Catholic faith who have left the faith and started practicing things that the Catholic Church doesn't approve of, their method of torture is okay because it's the good of the soul that matters. The body has to suffer, argues the Inquisitor, for the soul to then be redeemed. Voltaire continues on by saying, I would take the liberty to respond, my brother, perhaps you are reasonable. I am convinced that you wish to do me good. But could I not be saved without all of that? Here, Voltaire is pointing out how pernicious and how violent some of this behavior is as a means of trying to save the soul of another person. To try to bring that person back into a religion that has a foundation of tolerance and being kind to people, and as a figure at its heart who was benevolent and kind to people. And in order to get people to follow that particular figure, you're going to torture them, you're going to hurt them, you're going to promise them mercy but then condemn them, you're going to apply 5 different tortures to them. You're going to believe one person's accusation, even if that person is a known liar. If they say that person is a heretic, then the Inquisition will just take their word for it and go investigate you, go arrest you, potentially torture you to get you to admit that you're a heretic, when really you might not be. That seems excessive, argues Voltaire. That seems like it's not keeping with the peaceable nature that you claim is the foundation of your church. Can't you save people without all of the harm, without all of the violence, without all of the nefarious tactics? Isn't there a more peaceful way to do this, to entice people to come back to the faith who have left it? Pointing out a flaw in the thinking of the Inquisition and of the Catholic Church that sponsors the Inquisition. So to wrap all this up in a nice bow, oh, excuse me, there's one quote left. Pardon me. To wrap up the quotes that we're going to look at here, Voltaire says the following. Not only is it extremely cruel to persecute in this brief life those who do not think the way we do, something he's already established with the previous parable, but I do not know if it might be too presumptuous, that's a key word here, to declare their eternal damnation. It seems to me that it does not pertain to the atoms of the moment, such as we are, to anticipate the decrees of the Creator. Here, Voltaire is building on what we just talked about in the previous quote, about how it seems like it's cruel to physically hurt people who don't believe the way that you believe. And it's also building on his earlier statement that people should have the freedom to believe what they want and worship what they want. And worship how they want, excuse me. In addition to that, though, he says, I'm not sure if it's too presumptuous to declare their eternal damnation. He argues in the second half of this quote that human beings are flawed, frail, imperfect creatures. It is difficult for flawed, imperfect, fragile creatures to understand a being like God who is permanent, who is eternal, who is perfect, who is all good, who is all powerful, who is not frail and fragile. It is difficult, if not impossible, for our human brains to fully comprehend such an entity, argues Voltaire. And because we cannot fully understand what a perfect, all-powerful, all-good being would want, it's dangerous and arrogant for us to think that that being would want us to hurt people and eternally damn them because they believed something that is not what we believe, or because they worship in a way that is not the way that we worship. It is arrogant for us as imperfect humans to think that we know God so well and know what God would want so well that we can then just say, well, if you don't believe the way the Catholic Church believes, you're damned for eternity. If you don't worship the way the Catholic Church says you should worship, we're going to torture you to get you to worship the way we want to worship. or we want you to worship. It seems presumptuous, to use Voltaire's term, to think that you know that for certain, when that might not be the case, because you're dealing with a being that is so far and beyond human beings that it's almost indescribable, that is almost incomprehensible of a being. And yet we think we know what that being wants so much that we're approving the use of physical torture because people have believed differently than one church says that you believe. They want to worship differently than one church says that they should worship. So now, wrapping up all of these parables and all of these quotes together, we can see a few themes emerge in Voltaire's Treatise on Toleration. First, he argues that superstitions are unnecessary. We don't need those superstitions. They can be replaced by reason. Reason is good. Reason is one of the bywords of the Enlightenment, and Voltaire is no exception to being a fan of reason. It's penetrating further and further into France. More people are being exposed to reason. More are using reason. Reason is good. It should replace the superstitions that institutional churches like the Catholic Church now peddle to the people. Intolerance is bad. And by the reverse side of that coin, tolerance is good. People should have the freedom to think what they want about religion, about politics, about society, about anything. They should have the freedom to think whatever they want about those things and more. They should have the freedom to worship how they wish to worship, to practice their faith in the way that best seems fit for them. They should have the freedom to talk about their own beliefs and their different ways of doing things and their different thoughts, and not be persecuted by individuals or by their state or by their church. In the first of his parables, we saw that he argues that many religions claim to be the one true faith, but how can they all be the one true faith simultaneously? That doesn't make logical sense. That's not a reasonable position to maintain. He also, in the second parable about the Dominican Inquisitor, argues that hurting people who are different is wrong and is not something that should be practiced. It's not something that should be done. Because, in the final bullet point, flawed humans can't really know what a perfect, almost indescribable God would really want us to do. That wraps up a look at Voltaire's Treatise on Toleration. I hope that this makes sense. I hope that we, as an audience and as a group of historians, have a better understanding of what Voltaire's points are in this one particular document. If you have any questions, and you are a current student of mine, you can please feel free to reach out to me anytime with any questions, any confusions, any issues you have with this via my school email or via our course LMS internal messaging system. Please do not hesitate to contact me, and I'll do my best to get back to you quickly and answer whatever your questions or concerns may be. If you are not a current student of mine, please feel free to leave a question or a comment in the comment section below. But as always, do not abuse my comment section. Please don't make me regret opening up the comment section on this video. Please don't make me feel like I have to turn the comments off because everyone's just going to start flame wars pointlessly talking about this issue. Please follow Voltaire's lead. Be indulgent, be respectful, be tolerant to people in the comment section, please. That's going to do it for our brief look at Voltaire. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope to see you all again in the next video.